Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and today we continue to hear about the possibility that the Russians could be getting ready for another series of mass mobilization efforts, to include the conscripting and recruitment of up to 500,000 additional Russian troops for further operations in Ukraine. That's on top of the already 300 plus thousand that have been recruited by the Russian military. Recruited, drafted, conscripted, what have you. And this is in conjunction with the reported prospects of a major Russian offensive that could take place, by some accounts, as early as February or even March. Now, I think that is highly unlikely. I don't think it's highly unlikely that we will not see the continued mobilization efforts of the Russian military, but I think a major Russian offensive operation in early spring, late winter, again, highly unlikely. If the Russians are looking at recruiting another hundreds of thousands of troops, it is going to take some time to, one, draft those personnel, get those personnel to military training areas, adequately train and then equip those forces, and then quite literally create whole units out of some of these forces. Obviously, some of them will be used to backfill and reconstitute existing formations, but a lot of these troops, from what we're hearing, will be used to create new Russian units, divisions. And the Russians are going to need to do that if they're planning a successful new series of offensive operations against the Ukrainians. Now, where are the likely invasion routes, new invasion routes for the Russian military? We keep hearing here in the north, and you can see on our map here where major operations are taking place here in the east, and then in the north, you can see where prior operations occurred, and the Russians were driven back to the existing borders, Belarusian Russian borders. But on the initial invasion, we did see the Russians move west of the Dnieper River with the goal of seizing control of Kiev. And if you go back to my very first videos, when we were looking at the Russian military buildup, and we were looking at the invasion route coming from Belarus into Ukraine, just how difficult that would be. And that hasn't changed. And if you, again, look at the invasion route from the Belarusian border into Ukraine, you see a very, very challenging terrain in which the Russians are going to have to operate under. And this terrain seriously benefits the defender, which obviously would be the Ukrainians. So you're looking at pontoon bridge operations. What's different now than what was different at the beginning of the war? Well, the Ukrainians, in all probability, have a better capability of targeting any pontoon bridges that the Russians are going to set up. We're also going to see these forces start to stage if there's going to be an invasion from Belarus into Ukraine. There are not a lot of routes into Ukraine for large mechanized formations that the Russians can use, roads. So again, all along this border is heavily forested with large rivers. And as the Russians mass, which they obviously would have to in these areas, they're going to come under attack from HIMARS and other systems that the West has handed over to the Ukrainians. And then the movement of those forces along these very narrow roads through heavily forested areas, again, is not going to benefit the Russian military. And you see here, major river crossing. In all probability, these bridges have been blown by the Ukrainians, or could be blown very, very quickly. And during the initial invasion by the Russians, the Ukrainians were able to successfully blow some of these bridges that the Russians were going to have to cross over to then enter Kiev. So again, this invasion route is going to take the Russians through very heavily forested areas, through interdispersed towns and villages, and then ultimately another area of heavily urbanized areas with more forest, more river crossings, and then finally a very, very dense urban area, which is Kiev, with a very deep metro facility as well, where the Ukrainians can use these underground tunnels to move forces. So again, if the Russians are looking to cross from Belarus into Ukraine and then seize control of Kiev, that is going to be a very difficult operation for round two. Very difficult indeed. What other possible plans could the Russians be looking at? Well, another one could be an operation closer to the Polish border, designed to push past the Ukrainian-Belarusian border, and then look to possibly disrupt the ability of the Ukrainian military to obtain supplies from the West. And that's even going to be a larger, much more expansive operation than a operation south towards Kiev. So again, unlikely. If we look at the most likely of operations, it's probably going to be, again, east of the Dnieper River. East of the Dnieper River in the direction of Chernihiv, probably most likely even further east, where the terrain becomes more advantageous to Russian forces. You can see here, if you were looking at the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, you can see clearly that things open up as you get further east, and this makes it more ideal for Russian tank formations. So this is where I believe the Russian, if the Russians launch an offensive operation, this is where it's going to come from. Further east, east of the Dnieper River, someplace running between Chernihiv and probably Sumy, maybe as far towards Kharkov. But again, difficult to say. And then compounding that, we're probably realistically not looking at a major Russian offensive operation towards late summer. That's best case scenario if the Russians are mobilizing these forces for a possible large-scale military operation. Look, all these recruits that the Russians are garnering are going to have to go through a period of training, and it's much too complicated to be done that quickly and then expect any sort of success by February or March. I just don't believe it's going to happen like that. Could be wrong, but who knows? In the equipping of Ukrainian forces, very, very interesting tidbit of information. So it looks like, and this really shows you just how invested the United States is into supporting the Ukrainians. The U.S. is now taking Sea Sparrow missiles, and we're going to give these Sea Sparrow missiles, and we're going to do some retrofitting with existing Ukrainian air defense systems, such as the Buk. And in the Buk air defense system is now going to be used to fire Sparrow missiles. And it's interesting because the Buk has better range than the Sea Sparrow, up to 20 plus miles, the Buk. The Sea Sparrow, I believe, is around 10 to 15 mile range. Now, the Sea Sparrow, in all probability, the ones that were given the Ukrainians, are probably more advanced than the existing Buk missile systems that they are using. So, whereas the Ukrainians have more range with the Buks, the Sea Sparrows are probably more technologically advanced than those missile systems, but have shorter range. But it's interesting to see that the United States is on the ground figuring out ways to retrofit some of these existing Ukrainian systems. And the Ukrainians, prior to the war, had over 70 of these Buk missile systems, air defense weapon systems. So, and it also shows you, in all probability, that the Russians have destroyed a lot of the Buk missiles that the Ukrainians possessed. They have probably gone after and successfully destroyed a lot of these Ukrainian depots where the Ukrainians had these Buk missile systems, and that's why they are getting these Sea Sparrow weapons, missiles from the U.S. to then be used on these mobile Buk systems. So very, very interesting, and obviously we'll have to continue to watch what other weapon systems the Ukrainians receive from the United States. Obviously, we heard about the Bradley, the Martyr, the AMX-10RC, these armored fighting vehicles. But what else are the Ukrainians going to get? We're hearing about the JDAM, the Joint Direct Attack Munition. How is that going to be used? In what way is that going to be used? Because the Ukrainians probably don't have much of an air force at this point. And the ability for the Ukrainian Air Force to launch a plane and then successfully deploy the JDAM, I would think at this point is not going to make a big impact on the war. So then the question is how are these JDAMs going to be used by the Ukrainians? Well, we don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. So that covers our what we're going to talk about today. I appreciate everyone joining us today, and we will, of course, have more very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.